Good afternoon to our friends in Europe. Good morning to those in the United States. My name is Ville Sinkonen. I'm the leading researcher at the Center on US Politics and Power at FIA, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you all to today's Transatlantic Currents webinar, which is entitled US Security Interests in Latin America, Drugs, Illegal Immigration, and China. And we could not ask for a better speaker to enlighten us on this vital topic. I wish to extend a warm FIA welcome to Ambassador Todd Robinson, who served as the Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs from September 2021 until January 2025. Previously, he has served as Senior Advisor for Central America in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, charged affairs in Caracas, Venezuela, and US Ambassador to the Republic of Guatemala. Ambassador Robinson's other assignments include Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, Deputy Chief of Mission at the US Embassy in Guatemala, Consul General Barcelona, and Chief of the Political and Economic Section in the US Embassy in Tirana, Albania. Other overseas postings include the Dominican Republic, Bolivia, Vatican City, Italy, El Salvador, and Colombia. In Washington, D.C., Ambassador Robinson served in the department's Operations Center and as a special assistant to former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. He is the recipient of the Presidential Rank Award and 2 Department Superior Honor Awards. He's a native of New Jersey, was a professional journalist before joining the Foreign Service, and is a graduate of the Georgetown University Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, class of 1985. So happy 40th year anniversary of your graduation, Ambassador Robinson. Ambassador Robinson will be interviewed by our own non-resident fellow, Ambassador Deborah McCarthy. Deborah is an expert on U.S. foreign and national security policy. She was the senior advisor on U.S. engagement in the UN Ad Hoc Committee on Cybercrime in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement at the Department of State until recently. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and recently she was also a senior fellow at Harvard University. So now with the introductions out of the way, a quick note for the audience. I will keep an eye on the chat for all your insightful questions, and you can start typing them right away as the interview begins. So without further ado, ambassadors, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ville. And I must say, to add to the bio, that Todd is not only a friend, but he was my boss for my last 3 years in the government. So I'm really going to enjoy asking him questions. But I thought I'd start on this session as we focus on the Western Hemisphere to talk, first of all, about the priority given to Latin America in U.S. foreign policy. And I went through our national security strategies for the, President Obama's, President Biden's, and also the first Trump administration. And you see an expansion of the focus. Under Obama, the priorities in the region included the promotion of democracy, economic integration, energy security, and obviously reducing the flow of drugs. Under the first administration, there was the additional high priority given to illegal immigration. Under the Biden administration, goals expanded even further to include health security, particularly after COVID, climate change, and obviously addressing external threats, meaning Russia and China. But even though the region is in our national security strategies, it's often been said that it does not seem to be a priority and has not been a priority for the US in the past 2 decades, as we, the United States, focused on the war on terror, the Indo-Pacific region, and most recently, obviously, the war in Ukraine and the Israel-Gaza conflict. So let me start with this, Todd. Do you agree that there's been benign neglect of the region, you who spend so much time there, or am I misreading a little bit the priority given to it in our national security strategies?
No, I think it's a great question. I think it might be a little of both. It might be a little bit of a misread, but it also might be a little bit of benign neglect, not and not for totally bad reasons. Let me explain. I think in general, uh, uh, past administrations have looked at Latin America in the context of all of these other uh, emergencies that have been going on. You had two wars in Iraq. You had the ups and downs of the Middle East. You had Afghanistan. Um, you have two large emerging threats, China and Russia, and all of their mal influence around the world. So, while we would like to focus on on the Western Hemisphere, the fact is we're pulled in these other directions. But I think the reason that it's a little bit of a misread, um, I believe that most Latins in the hemisphere have bought into the democratic exercise. Like they understand and they believe in democratic institutions. They expect some measure of accountability from their governments. They have regular elections. You know, the outliers being Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. But if you look at the rest of Latin America, the march of democracy has been extraordinary uh, for 100 years. You know, and so it's sort of easy to not forgetting, not ignoring the problems. You know, the Central America wars of the 80s and the 90s. It's easy to overlook those things, and we shouldn't. But when you look at the Western Hemisphere vis-a-vis the threats to democracy in other parts of the world, I think these administrations would be you should cut them a little slack for not focusing totally on the region.
Well, you served as ambassador to Guatemala under President Obama, and you served as charge in Venezuela under President Trump. What changes did you observe in the approach of each administration to the region?
Yeah, well, it's night and day, right? I mean, under President Obama, we were focused on consolidating democratic institutions, supporting the free press and non-governmental organizations. AID was both AID and the Peace Corps were huge parts of the national security infrastructure and strategy for President Obama. And I happened to be in Guatemala at an extraordinary time where, we didn't know it at while we were there, but we saw a president go to jail. We saw a vice president go to jail. We saw a member of the central bank go to jail. A third of the Congress, four presidents of Congress, of the Guatemalan Congress, either went to jail or became fugitives of justice, all for corruption. All of this happened because of their involvement in corruption. You contrast that a little bit with the approach from President Trump. We pulled back. even then, we pulled back on some of our programs, and it became much more of a transactional relationship. You do this, and this may happen. You do this, and this definitely will not happen. And in the case of Venezuela, I have to say, I don't think in the beginning they actually knew what they wanted to do with Venezuela, and so it was. I was given a lot of free rein to sort of figure out what our strategy was going to be, what our goals were going to be, and how we might achieve them. And I think in the end, because I had been given such free rein, that became a real threat to the Maduro regime, and I only lasted 6 months.
Well, now we are in the second Trump administration, and it is pursuing, as I'm sure our participants know, an America First strategy. And protecting America, in the words of Secretary Rubio, means paying attention to the Western Hemisphere, our own neighborhood. The priorities are not, however, strengthening governance, economic engagement, or dismantling authoritarian regimes. It's more protecting the United States from the flow of drugs and immigrants and pushing back on China's role in the region, a security-driven agenda. Now, the president has designated 10 drug cartels and criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. So this is a new approach. It's expelled gang members and taken other steps. As Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Narcotics and Law Enforcement, which is not well known outside of the United States, you led global efforts to stop the flow of drugs, with the current threat being mostly fentanyl. Can you talk a little bit about your efforts, not only within the region, and especially I'm thinking Mexico, which is a big source, but also China, because I know you engage with China on this issue.
Yeah, while this is why I say your first question is so interesting. Two of our largest programs worldwide are in Latin America, Mexico, and Colombia, and so the focus on international or transnational crime and corruption and narcotics trafficking have been there for decades. I mean, you'll of course remember Colombia in the late 80s and the early 90s. Right. More recently, the work we've been doing in Mexico in terms of, again, training and equipping non-military security, so the border guards, the police, working with prosecutors, working with judges. Our Mexico program is probably $125 million a year. Our Colombia program pushing almost $300 million a year, and that goes a long way towards solidifying relationships and working on strategies together. You probably know, but I don't know if your audience does. The work we have done with Colombia since the late 80s has absolutely been extraordinary. When I was there from 87 to 89, there were serious discussions about Colombia becoming a failed state. This was at the height of Pablo Escobar and Carlos Leder and all of these crime syndicates that were threatening to take over the country. If you fast forward to today, Colombia is a net exporter of security. We use Colombian trainers and experts to help us on our helicopter programs in Peru. We send their experts to West Africa to show them, because the traffickers are looking for new networks and strategies and countries to build in, and the Colombians are helping us help these other countries around the world. So yeah, I mean, I think that was the focus of past administrations, Republican and Democratic. I think where the Trump administration has lost a little bit of focus is that they are not building on the foundation of what past administrations have done. They've sort of pushed that aside and essentially tried to force other countries to do their bidding, and I'm not sure that's a winning strategy.
Well, I note that the Foreign Terrorist Organization, well, let me ask the question a different way. Tools for this administration, they've designated certain groups as foreign terrorist organizations, which triggers certain authorities. But at the same time, they're chopping away at the State Department budget, which certainly has implications, for the INL Bureau. I mean, what will this lead to? Are they going to be better able at fighting the flow of drugs, or are they really tying their hands?
Well, I've this won't surprise you at all. I've testified before Congress, both the House and the Senate, several times, and have been asked this question every single time. The fact is, we had all the tools necessary to go after these networks. The foreign terrorist designation doesn't give DEA, DOJ, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Department of Justice, the State Department. It doesn't give us any more ammunition than we already had. It's a great headline, and it may make us look tougher, but the fact is, it doesn't really enhance what we were already doing. And I have to say, we've been doing a lot. We've been having a lot of successes, particularly on, and we'll probably talk about it a little more later, but particularly on the synthetic drug, the synthetic opioid crisis. The work we've been doing with Mexico on this issue, we had been doing during my time in INL, really has been extraordinary. We developed a great partnership. The Mexicans completely bought in to working with us to work more closely with China on making sure that they do everything they can to go after the companies that were moving these precursor chemicals around the country. I traveled to China 3 times. I met with my counterparts in China in Austria once, all to focus on precursor chemicals and the flow of synthetic drugs. And what we were able to do with our great Mexican counterparts really helped, really enhance our ability to get China to do more.
And would you assume that the Chinese will continue this cooperative relationship, because the focus of this administration is to curb the flow?
Right. I hope so, but I'm not so sure. I mean, we were able to make progress with China, one, because we wore our vulnerabilities on our sleeves. From 2019 to 2022, I think, over 100,000 Americans died every year from some interaction with synthetic drugs. If not for COVID, that would have been the number one national public health crisis in America. And we basically went to the world and said, this is coming to you. We are the canary in the coal mine. So if you don't start working together, if you don't start working with us, and if you don't start telling China that they have to do more to stop the flow of these precursor chemicals, what you see in America is what you're going to see on the streets of Europe. It's what you're going to see in Australia and New Zealand. It's what you're going to see in Latin America. And, you know, to his credit, Secretary Blinken understood this. He tasked us with starting this global coalition to fight synthetic opioids. We went from 0 countries in 2023 to over 160 countries and 15 different international organizations worldwide to get experts together, to get law enforcement together, to get intelligence groups together to focus on these issues. China was invited. They never took us up on the invitation, but they did start, because they weren't just hearing it from the United States, they did start doing more to curb the flow, and we bent the curve on deaths in America. So by the end, by 2024, 2025, the rates were going down, and the Biden-Harris administration did more than any other administration, Republican or Democratic, to get communities in the United States to do more on better access to treatment for synthetic drugs. All of that really helped bend the curve. There was no one silver bullet. We had to do it internationally, and we had to do it domestically.
On both sides. Well, I wanted to move to the issue of illegal immigration from Latin America. And President Trump has declared a national emergency at the southern border. And with that declaration, he has access to additional powers. He's issued executive orders stopping certain programs, the so-called catch and release. And he's also ended humanitarian parole for certain groups. He's also, his administration is also pushing to have foreign governments take back their citizens, though he's not the first, this is not the first administration to do this by any means, but with additional threats of imposing sanctions and visa restrictions. We saw in Colombia when they first wouldn't accept their citizens back, they slapped visa restrictions on immediately that were subsequently lifted. And some of the moves that the administration has taken have been challenged in court. Now, the bureau that you ran is not in charge of immigration policy, but focuses on security issues. And as you said, because I did my homework and looking at various presentations, there's a direct connection between security, opportunity, and good governance. Can you talk a little bit about our U.S. security initiatives to stem the flow of illegals from the perspective of where you sat?
Sure. You know, like I said, we focus on civilian security. And so we're talking about the police, we're talking about prosecutors, we're talking about border authorities, not so much customs, but certainly the immigration authorities. We do training. We make sure, particularly with our Mexican colleagues, we make sure that they have the training and the equipment that they need to work best with the United States. You know, because we share a border, we want to make sure that we are coordinated, that we're collaborating, that we're sharing information, that we're using the same types of equipment. And what we want to make sure is that we're using equipment that is both trustworthy and accountable on both sides of the border. What does that mean? That means making sure that that they're buying, let's say, Western-friendly equipment as opposed to equipment produced in the PRC, for instance. And we don't want to just do that with Mexico. We want to do that throughout the hemisphere. We want to make sure, well, we want to do it around the world, but we want to focus on the hemisphere. And so that's where INL comes in. We make sure that our DHS colleagues, that our Department of Justice colleagues are the ones we send to do the training and to provide the equipment that's necessary to make sure that we're sharing information that is verifiable and can be shared with some confidence. We already do that with Canada. Our relationship with Canada has historically been great, but of course, you know, the historic relationship between the United States and Mexico has had its ups and downs. I would say during my time in government, it's been more up than down, and we'll see. You know, I think the approach that President Sheinbaum has taken in Mexico has been good for Mexico. You know, she's been tough. She's not gonna stand down. She's not gonna be threatened. My feeling is the old adage, you know, you attract more flies with honey, actually works. We'll see if the change in strategy works. I'm not confident it will be as successful as it has been with past administrations.
Because the tactic is very much Mexico being somewhat the exception of having negotiated things behind the scenes of the threats if they don't take their citizens back, and very much focused just on that. So
right.
And
but
many of them have caved and caved. They're obliged to take their citizens back, but it's the way it's being done, I think, that's being questioned.
But you know, it's a two-edged sword, right? It's not enough just to take their citizens back. I mean, the reason there's one of the reasons, among many, I'm sure, but one of the reasons their citizens are here is because they can't make it in the country that they're coming from. So if you send citizens back to an unstable, unwelcoming environment, they're just going to turn around and try to come back again. I mean, they're not going to say, oh, well, you know, it didn't work this time. Maybe I can try again in my country and do whatever. If those countries that you're sending the citizens back to aren't able to offer a better life for those citizens you send back, they're going to leave again. We've seen that in the past. And that's why it's so crucial, I think, to work with these countries, you know, to work on issues big and small, right? You had AID and Peace Corps working on meat and potato issues, you know, how to get water out of the ground, how to get crops to market, those kinds of things. But you also need greater transparency, good governance, and accountability from the institutions that are supposed to be taking care of these people. And, you know, if you can do those things, then you have a better chance of success when you send migrants back. But if you don't, then at best, you're sending them back to an iffy future in their own country. And at worst, you're just, you know, biding time until they make another shot at coming back to the United States.
Well, I wanted to turn now to China's role in the region. It's varied over time, starting out with raw material deals, moving to lending and finance agreements, to efforts to get countries to join the Belt and Road Initiative. And I note that Colombia just joined. And a new twist, which is offering mill-to-mill education. Obviously, China's also lobbied countries in the region to drop their support for Taiwan. And I note that recently Xi Jinping just hosted many heads of state at a China-Latin American summit in Beijing. Both the Trump and the Biden administrations, Trump 1 and the Biden administration, tried to offer what I call high quality alternatives on the financial side. President Trump set up the Development Finance Corporation to invest in the region as well as others. And President Biden launched the American Partnership for Economic Prosperity. But the US hasn't put a lot of money in the region compared to China. I note, if my figures are correct, that the fiscal year 25 request, which was under the last year of President Biden, was only 2.2 billion, which is peanuts compared to what we give to countries such as Egypt, Ukraine, and other places. During your time in the region, how did you see China work on the ground to expand its influence, and what tools did we use on the ground to respond or to push back? I should say.
Yeah, it's an interesting and it's a vexing problem. The People's Republic of China has some amazing advantages in their ability to promote their form of economic strategy and investment around the world. They don't have a foreign corrupt act. So their businesses are free to use whatever tools, both legal and illegal, to get companies and governments to sign on the bottom line. They are more than willing to offer grants and loans at what's the word?
Usurious.
Yes. Terms to countries that are susceptible, that are vulnerable to those kinds of terms. Europe and the United States can't really do that, right? All of our contracts have to be legal. Our offers have to be above board. And so, you mentioned the Development Finance Corporation, American Partnership for Economic APEP, Economic Prosperity. At the end of the day, those are programs that invite U.S. companies to take a look at the Latin market, but they can't. They don't force these companies. You can't force these companies to do it. And when companies in Europe or in the United States are really focused on their shareholders, they're going to be looking for good deals. They're going to be looking for, they're not investing out of the goodness of their heart. They're investing to make a profit. And if they can do that, then they're more than willing to partner with the U.S. government on these issues. But they can only partner with the U.S. government if the money is there. And you hit the nail on the head. If there is no new money, if Congress doesn't authorize new money for these programs, then the executive's hands are tied, because all they have is what they have. And if they're taking money from the Middle East to use in Latin America, then that administration has to explain to somebody, to their constituents in Ohio or Michigan, or wherever why they're doing that. And that's a really, really hard sell. Again, that's something the United States government doesn't invest in Latin America. Companies invest in Latin America. If it's profitable for them to do it, they're going to do it. Now, what I will say is these Latin American countries, by and large, they want the West. They want Europe. They want the United States there. They want those companies there because that's a good seal of approval for them. That means, that their markets, if their markets are open to the West and are attractive to the West, that means that that these companies have confidence that they're going to get a fair shake in their judicial system, that they're going to get a fair shake in the legislature, that they are open and emerging and transparent markets. So at the end of the day, they want the Western companies there. But if they're desperate and the Western companies aren't going to come, then they're going to look elsewhere. And I think that's what you're seeing in countries like Peru and Colombia.
Well, President Trump came into office talking about taking over the Panama Canal, and this we're going to get into tactics being used. An issue is that a subsidiary of a Hong Kong company has concessions for 2 out of the 5 ports along the canal. With PRC control of Hong Kong, the link to China was obviously the concern. Since then, a U.S. company is trying to buy the Hong Kong company out, though I gather the Chinese government is really examining this closely. But Panama has withdrawn from the Belt and Road Initiative. It's also taken back some of its citizens expelled from the U.S. Given your experience in the region, will the Trump approach, as illustrated in the case of Panama, work in terms of reducing Chinese influence? I mean, in this case, the Hong Kong company is moving to sell for whatever reasons. It could be for business reasons or whatever. I'm not privy to that, but I'm just curious as to whether this is an approach that'll work.
Well, I think, again, I might have tipped my hand in the beginning of this conversation. I think the short answer is no. I mean, I don't think you can browbeat sovereign countries into bending to your will. That's not how we've generally done it historically. Historically, the United States and the West really is about building partnerships. It's about our markets being attractive to them and their markets being attractive to us. And it's about building the institutions from the ground up that make that possible. And I maybe it's me, maybe I'll be proven wrong, but I just don't think that that threatening to go back on agreements that you've made is going to work in the long term towards getting countries to do the right thing or to do what we want. And I want to reiterate, because I think it's important, these countries in Latin America are already predisposed to working with the United States. They're already predisposed to working with, our European allies. We just have to find a way to do it that, helps them along as we work with them. I think embarrassing them, I think, threatening them, it's the diplomat in me, but I just don't think that's the way to go. But we'll see.
Well, we've, though this wasn't on the headlines for our discussion today, I thought we should also talk a little bit about Russia's efforts in Latin America. I mean, it doesn't have the economic power of China. It values its close security and mill-to-mill relationship, obviously with Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, and sells arms to a couple of others. It has carried out information operations throughout the region to project what I call its version of the truth on Ukraine, and also to undermine US policy. And selectively, it's also carrying out cyber attacks. I mean, during those negotiations at the UN, Costa Rica had a cyber attack from Russia, a Russian group that closed down the entire government. They had to invoke emergency powers. It was quite extraordinary, and the US helped them tremendously. But my question is in your view, how effective are Russia's efforts in the region? I mean, you've been in Washington, the policy level, but also on the ground. How effective are they in what they're doing?
Well, I have to say, I don't think it's been terribly effective. They haven't gained any ground in the last 40 or 50 years, right? I mean, they still have, the countries they have are the countries they have. Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela. They're not, sometimes you'll get a more progressive government in Latin America. Sometimes you get a less progressive government in Latin America, but it's not like Russia is picking off, countries throughout Latin America. I think they've been good at using the countries they have as a base for their malign influence in the region. I think they've been expert at that, but I don't think they've been really good at engaging with other countries and convincing them that their model, their criminal government model, is the way to go. It works of course it works in Nicaragua, it works in Venezuela, and it works in Cuba, where you essentially have one-party criminal kleptocracies. But it's not going to work in Paraguay, Uruguay, Ecuador, where you have to go to the polls every however many years, right? It's not going to work in Colombia or Peru, where you have to go to the polls every few years, because at the end of the day, that's not what most Latins want. So, and I firmly believe that every time Russia or China gets caught in their malign influence campaigns, they take a hit every single time.
Well, I did note in the negotiations at the UN that the Russians were trying to use a heavy hand to convince the Latin American countries to vote with them, where China was a little more subtle, but the aim was there.
Yep.
So I think I'm going to pause here and see if we have any questions from our audience. I obviously have more questions I can ask, but Ville, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, ambassadors, both for a really enlightening discussion. I'm at least learning a lot as we go along. We have one question in the chat from our non-resident fellow Leo Michel, and I will read it out because I think there's also a bit of context before the question. So, in two cases, statements by Mr. Trump and some of his senior advisors since his inauguration have mentioned possible US military intervention to somehow deal with US concerns. Chinese involvement with functioning of the Panama Canal and drug cartel activities in Mexico. How seriously should one consider these statements, and how damaging are they to US diplomatic efforts to formulate and implement serious policies to actually deal with these concerns? So, not an easy question, but an important one nonetheless.
Well, I think it's a really great question, and we could have just done a session, I think, on this question alone. I think the short answer is if you're a diplomat and you're hearing these statements, like the world that diplomats live in is the world of flexibility, right? You want to be able to pivot in the direction that is going to be most helpful to your country. And when you hear statements like this coming from the highest levels of government, that doesn't give you the flexibility you need to work with the country. And then when you're talking about the historical context of a country like Mexico and the United States, I mean, I think it would be really challenging to be a United States diplomat in Mexico City or in any of the border consulates when statements like this are coming out of Washington. Because where do you go? Where do you go from here? How is that at all helpful to your strategy of trying to get your Mexican counterparts to they've already been doing. See, it's statements like this that make me think that that the people that are now in power, and I should say, I'm now retired, so I'm speaking freely, but this is largely my personal view. But this is when you see statements like this, it says to me that they just haven't done their homework, that they haven't looked at the historical context, that they haven't looked at the foundation that has been forged by past administrations, again, both Republican and Democratic, with our Mexican counterparts. The conversations that we have today with Mexico are fundamentally different than the conversations we were having with Mexico when I first came into the Foreign Service in 1986, 1987, where we were afraid to say the word Mexico as U.S. diplomats because the relationship was so fraught. And that's just not the case today, and that's largely because we've done the hard work to build an adult relationship with a country that means so much to the United States. And so, this is just in my opinion, a repudiation of that relationship building that we've done.
And I guess we should not forget also that, our history of military interventions in the region. I mean, during my early days, we invaded Grenada. I mean, we went into Panama. I was the duty officer that night. That was interesting. And then fast forward to bring back President Aristide, we sent in our military to Haiti, which has had a long, convoluted relationship with the United States and our interventions. So it's a sensitive subject historically. Absolutely.
And, again, maybe it's the diplomat in me, but I think it's way too early to give up on diplomatic solutions rather than military solutions, certainly in our hemisphere.
Thank you for that extremely good answer to what is a really sort of difficult question fraught with various different avenues. There's no questions currently in the chat, so before we go to Deborah's extra question, I've actually going to use the prerogative of the chair and ask a question. You mentioned China, and by implication, of course, you mentioned China's investment in the region and its infrastructure investment. Now, of course, since the Biden era, there has been an attempt by the West to challenge the BRI, at least on the level of rhetoric. Now, I would be interested in hearing how you see it on the ground, especially when it comes to cooperation, for instance, between the United States and the European Union under the rubric of the PGII, whether there's actually anything concrete going on in the ground that would lead us to then believe that all of this sort of posturing vis-a-vis the BRI is actually having an impact on the ground, on where people of the region actually see it having an effect?
Yeah, I actually think there is a positive effect. I think there's more that can be done. I think, China, again, they have the luxury of being able to say, this is what will be done, and then ordering their industry to do it. For the United States and for Europe, it's a lot harder. But I think, when we work together on these issues, I'm trying to think, in the Caribbean, there are some projects. I want to say in Colombia and Ecuador, maybe Peru, there are some projects on the ground that collaborating both at a government level, but perhaps more importantly, at an industry level. Europe and the United States are doing more, recognizing that alone, neither one of them is in a position to do the kinds of investment that China does. But the other thing, the more maybe equally important, what Europe and the United States are doing are showing these countries how to better monitor, track, and create the kinds of agreements that are going to be sustainable over the long term. It's always important to look at the fine print when you're doing business in the Belt and Road Initiative. And many times these countries, particularly countries that are desperate and don't have that tradition of transparency and good governance, they overlook the fine print. And I think that European diplomats and U.S. diplomats are collaborating really well in training, industry groups, chambers of commerce, lawyers, and judges to understand better what goes into, a sort of a Western-made contract versus what goes into a contract based in the Belt and Road model. And I think we could do more. These are the kinds of subjects that should be taught in universities, at business schools in the region, so that people have confidence when they go. The university students of today are the ministers and chief justices of tomorrow, and chief prosecutors, attorney generals of tomorrow. And if they have that foundation today, they will become better advocates on their own behalf later on. And I think that we have been in the past. I don't know if we're still doing it, but we have been in the past helping these organizations and universities do that.
That's an extremely important point about capacity building. I think that is a big part of what both the EU and the United States are doing globally. Of course, then it's a different question of what the prospects are in the next few years of this kind of collaboration. But before we go into that, I want to get to Deborah's extra question, and we have about 5 minutes left.
All right, so we can go quickly.
Go ahead.
Like the newscasters, we have 30 seconds and is the world going to end? No. I wanted to turn briefly to U.S. and European cooperation in international organizations. Countries in the Western Hemisphere have a mixed track record of voting on some of our priorities. I'm thinking United States. Only El Salvador, for example, joined the US-led coalition in Afghanistan. Only 7 Latin American countries supported the war in Iraq. And fast forward to today, though most voted in favor of the initial UN General Assembly resolutions condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, 2 key allies, Mexico and Brazil, abstained from the resolution suspending Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. So my question is, as every vote counts on many, not only at the UN, but many other international institutions, what are the most effective ways for US and European countries to get more consistent support from the region to our common positions in international organizations? Rather a broad, large question, but we'll try.
I'll see if I can do it in 30 seconds or less. Number one, I think you have to treat countries with respect. You can't just bludgeon them into supporting your position. You also, number two, you have to offer something. You have to give them something they can use, either to convince their own constituents or their own legislatures, or to convince them. You can't just assume that they're going to support you out of their good graces. Sometimes they might, but that's not always going to be the case. The UN is a fantastic institution, but it could use some reform. And I think, you and I were engaged in hand-to-hand combat over the cybercrime treaty at the UN. There are issues like that throughout the international system. And we have to find a way to make sure that these institutions that we built are working for us, working for the collective us. I think both Russia and China have recognized that as long as these institutions exist, they want to be in the leadership positions in many of the departments in these institutions, and we've sort of let that go by the wayside. I think it's time for the United States and Europe to retake that territory and reaffirm the transparency and good governance that we promote individually around the world. We need to do it in these international organizations as well.
Well said.
How did I do?
Great. We are exactly 1 minute before closure. Over to you, Ville.
Thank you so much. We are exactly on time, and that's an important note on being awake to the kind of influence that other countries are trying to obtain through international organizations. Look, this has been an important discussion on a region and a dimension of U.S. foreign policy that does not get enough airtime in our neck of the woods. So I really want to thank Deborah for the great moderation and Ambassador Robinson for taking the time to join us today. I want to wish everyone a great rest of the day, and thank you so much for coming to our event. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
It was great. Thank you. Bye-bye.